for accepting the invitation to participate in our meeting. Just a few words. So Robert is a researcher at the National Museum of Natural Sciences in Madrid since 2018, and a member of the Department of Biogeography and Global Change. He's a conservation ecologist, as he says in his webpage, and his research focus on the effects of environmental changes on biodiversity, particularly in climate change and fragmentation in affecting butterflies, but much more than that. He has an impressive track record of studies, and today is going to speak about the detecting refugia from climate change based on colonization, local extinction, and changes to community composition. So again, thanks a lot, Robert, for your availability, and whenever you want, you can start.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference. I really enjoyed all the talks that I saw this morning. So the work I'm going to talk about today includes a small amount of work I did when I was still at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and then some ongoing work that I've been doing in Spain in the past few years. And a number of the photos that you are going to see in this talk, including this very nice one of the butterfly Argynis niobe on the title page here, were actually taken by one of your PhD students, Juan Pablo Cancela. So I'll get the acknowledgement in there to Juan Pablo right at the start of the presentation. So the main points I think I would like to make today are that colonization and local extinction are really key processes in the latitudinal and elevational changes to species geographic ranges that we're seeing in response to climate change. And these colonizations or local extinctions of populations also in turn can lead to the reorganization of ecological communities. Now, many of the changes that we're seeing in response to climate change are following expectations, but one important feature of these changes is that they're not gradual, they're not going to be gradual, because climate change itself is not gradual either in space or time. So we saw this morning in Brent Emerson's talk how over sort of geological time you get these hot and cold periods. We also see variation from year to year, and we see variation among the seasons. And we also see a lot of sort of fine resolution variation in climatic conditions and in the microclimate. And all of this variability in the climate influences local population responses. It influences rates and patterns of colonization and extinction. And so today what I want to talk about is how that variability in climatic conditions influences the responses of species distributions and ecological communities, and how evidence of those changes can in turn inform potential measures to adapt conservation to climate change. And one key context to this is the idea of refugia from climate change. So we might think about refugia as being locations which provide distinct climatic environments from the prevailing climatic conditions of the wider landscape. So locations such as high elevations could provide localized cool conditions, but also gradients of elevation or of aspect lead to much finer resolution heterogeneity in climatic conditions. And if we look at broad geographic scales at the European continent, for example, we know from paleoecological and phylogeographic evidence that locations in the Mediterranean basin provided refugia for species during the ice ages, whilst also in southern Europe, high elevation regions like the Alps and the Pyrenees have provided refuge for species during interglacial periods. And so as conservation biologists, we're interested in knowing whether those same kind of topographically variable or mountain systems can provide refuge for species against ongoing climate change. And so I'm going to really sort of present 5 sections to this talk about how we can sort of understand how species and ecological communities are responding to climate change and how that might inform about where refuge from climate change could be. I'll first of all provide some background on observed range shifts and changes to community composition and how they appear to be generally following expectations of the effects of a warming climate. But then I'll show some of the evidence for this spatial and temporal variation in microclimatic conditions and in rates of climatic change, and how those are likely to influence the kind of ecological responses we observe. And then the last 3 parts of the talk will be looking at some of that ecological evidence. First of all, in terms of the evidence that microclimatic variation could buffer plants and insects against local extinction caused by warming effects in England, so in Northern Europe. And in the last 2 parts of the talk, looking at variation in local extinction and colonization across butterfly elevation ranges in central Spain, and then looking more widely at changes to the composition of butterfly communities across the Iberian Peninsula. So we know, or we have pretty good evidence that climatic conditions are perhaps the major factor influencing the geographic ranges of many species. So with climatic warming, one of the main expectations was that the geographic ranges of species might shift, showing retractions of their distributions at low latitude range limits and expansion of their distributions at high latitude limits. And over the past 2 decades or so, pretty solid body of evidence has amassed that those kind of changes have been occurring. So here's one of the first pieces of evidence, a paper by Camille Parmesan and colleagues, showing the colonizations of a number of butterfly species at their northern range limits in Northern Europe, and the range retractions of those species at their limits here in North Africa and here in the northeastern Iberian Peninsula. We expect comparable changes over the elevational ranges of species distributions. So here's an example from some of our work from central Spain, looking at butterflies in the Sierra de Guadarrama, where there are historical samples of butterfly distributions from the late 1960s and early 1970s. And we carried out a resurvey of a number of sites in 2004 and 2005, and that we found for 16 mountain butterfly species, on average, the lower elevation limits had shifted uphill by just over 200 meters. And that was at the same time as a 1.3 degrees C increase in mean annual temperatures, which is equivalent to about a 220 meter uphill shift in isotherms. So there's also evidence of these uphill elevation shifts. And when researchers such as Ai-Ching Chen et al. In this paper in 2011, and also a paper by Jonathan Lenoir and colleagues from last year, when they've carried out meta-analyses across many of these such studies, they found that generally the latitudinal shifts observed in species distributions have been greater where temperatures have been warming more, where the expected latitudinal shift is greater, and also that elevational shifts tend to be further uphill, again, where conditions have warmed more. These changes in individual species distributions, of course, are going to also lead to changes in the composition of local ecological communities. So if we have a species like this one, Melitea cinxia, which tends to occur at sort of mid-altitudes in central Spain, sort of between about 800 and 1200 meters altitude, and a species like this one, Parnassus apollo, that tends to occur at the highest mountain altitudes. If we get these two species shifting their distributions uphill, we're going to get changes to the composition of the communities where they occur. And a fairly simple way that we can quantify these kind of changes to ecological communities is using indices such as the community temperature index, where we can summarize the thermal association of each of the constituent species based on the broader geographic distribution of those species. So if we look for Melitea cinxia across its European distribution in 50 kilometers squares, the average annual temperature across those 50 kilometer squares is 9.6 degrees C. So this is many sort of low altitudinal regions of Europe up to the North Sea and Scandinavia. We compare that with Parnassus apollo, which is generally restricted to mountainous regions throughout southern and central Europe and reaches some lower altitudinal regions in Scandinavia. The average temperature across those 50 kilometer squares is 9.6 degrees C for cinxia, is 8.14 degrees C for Apollo. And based on the assemblage of species that we have in a given location, we can summarize the thermal association of the community by taking the average species temperature index for that site, and we refer to that as the community temperature index. So if we look for that information on the butterfly distributions in the Sierra de Guadarrama in the late 1960s, and then between 2006 to 2012, we found that as the temperature warmed and isotherms shifted up the slopes of the mountain, that the community temperature index also increased on average. So the open triangles show the community temperature index of sample sites between 2006 and 12, and the solid symbols show the CTI between 67 and 73. And the average CTI shifted 160 meters uphill over those 4 decades. So it looked from that information that we collected about 10 to 15 years ago that the CTI, yes, it was increasing in those sites in the Sierra de Guadarrama, but it wasn't perhaps increasing as fast as the temperature change suggested it would increase. And apparently CTI was increasing less where there was greater cover of sort of natural habitat like forest or meadow. So is there a suggestion there that actually natural habitat could be slowing down the rate at which communities are changing? These kind of changes to CTI have also been looked at across Europe for a number of monitoring schemes of both birds and butterflies. Generally, CTI is increasing. It appears to have increased more for butterflies in these different nations than for birds. And also we see some regional variation. So a suggestion here from data from Catalonia that the CTI of butterflies has actually declined in the past 30 years. So does this information on variation in rates of community change give us some idea that different taxonomic groups are responding differently? Does it suggest that some species associated with cool conditions are not going extinct as quickly as we would expect them to? Or does it actually suggest that some of the species associated with warm conditions are not colonizing as fast as we would expect them to? And this has been referred to as a climatic debt. So the CTI not changing as fast as expected based on changes to the climatic conditions. So this sort of climatic debt, this lag behind rates of warming, it also appears to be evident in the fact that species elevation ranges are not shifting uphill as fast as you would expect them to based on rates of climatic warming. So if they were shifting uphill at the expected rate, you'd expect them to be along this 1-to-1 line here from the study of Chen et al. So that could either be because of barriers to colonization, or it could be in a sort of more positive way for conservation because of some kind of local buffers to the extinctions of populations. And maybe there might be a role of microclimatic variation in buffering populations against these negative impacts of climatic change. So we need to sort of think about how climate varies over space and time, and how rates of climatic change might also vary over space. So if we look for England and Wales, for example, we can see that rates of climatic warming between 1970 and 2009 were very variable. So in the sort of flatter, lower elevational areas of southeastern England, rates of warming were much faster than they were along the sort of western coastal region of England and Wales. If we sort of zoom in on this area here, the Lizard Peninsula outlined in a black square there, we can also see that at a more local scale, there's also considerable variation in rates of climatic warming. So for example, if we think about the sort of for southwest England, the amount of time that's actually above a warm temperature like 20 degrees C, along the western coast of the Lizard Peninsula here on south-facing slopes, we had increases over the course of 37 years of up to 256 hours in the annual number of hours above 20 degrees C, whereas on the sort of western coast of that peninsula and in north-facing slopes, we could actually get a decrease over the same period of time in the number of warm hours. So there's considerable local variation in rates of warming. And indeed, if we look at a national scale at the average summer temperatures, the average summer temperature increases, the variation we have within a small area of the landscape can actually exceed by a large degree the rates of climate change. So this might present opportunities for species to redistribute locally and therefore avoid the negative effects of climatic warming. This kind of variation in climate, in microclimatic and mesoclimatic conditions could result at a sort of a local scale from factors such as elevation, and factors such as aspect. And then at a much finer resolution, it can result from shading by vegetation or from microtopographic effects, for example, the effects of areas of bare ground here, which are leading to temperatures on a May morning on the Lizard Peninsula of up to 40 degrees at ground level, compared with only about 20 degrees C in the shade of this Armeria maritima plant here. So this variation in topography and vegetation could help to reduce the exposure of organisms to unfavorable climatic conditions, and it could help to reduce the distances that they might need to travel to maintain association with favorable conditions. So what's the evidence that this kind of microclimatic variation could protect species against climatic warming in the British Isles? So these next few slides will look at a study that we did with the National English Conservation Agency, National England, looking at 430 species which were declining in England and which, based on bioclimate models, were expected to show negative effects of climatic warming. And we looked at changes in the distributions of those species between their distribution at 10-kilometer resolution before 1989 and after 1990. And we analyzed the factors that influenced whether populations persisted in 10-kilometer squares or disappeared from those 10-kilometer squares over that period of time. We did that for 316 plants and 114 species of insects. And we were looking for whether there were effects of warming on persistence and whether there were also effects of microclimatic heterogeneity or an interaction between microclimatic heterogeneity and warming. We quantified microclimatic heterogeneity for each 10 kilometers square by calculating a measure of solar index for in terms of each 100-meter grid cell within that 10 kilometers square. And solar index was based on altitude, aspect, slope, and topographic shading by the surrounding landscape. And we quantified heterogeneity as the standard deviation among those 10,000 100-meter cells within each 10 kilometer square. So first of all, for those 430 species, 321 of them actually showed some effects of warming on their chances of persistence. And for those 321 species, 200 species actually showed a negative effect of warming. So 62% of the species were actually at greater risk of regional extinction where the warming was greater. In turn, 228 of those 321 species showed an effect of microclimatic variation on their persistence. And these ones here, these 86 species here, as well as showing a negative effect of warming, showed a positive effect of microclimatic variation on their persistence. And in terms of the interaction, so here's an example of a species where it was showing negative effects on persistence of warming, but a lower risk of extinction where microclimatic variation was greater. We then went further. We looked at whether there was an interaction with that microclimatic variation. And we found here for these species that there was a disproportionately greater reduction in their extinction risk where there was more microclimatic variation. So quite strong evidence for some 66% of species that showed negative effects of warming, that they had a positive interaction with microclimatic variation. We then looked at how much the difference was in the chances of survival between the most microclimatically variable grid squares and the least microclimatically variable grid squares. And we found that especially for species that were most negatively affected by warming, and those are these ones to the left here, there was a big effect of microclimatic variation on their chances of persistence. So based on this, we suspect, and we suggested this to the National Conservation Agency, that the regions that are shown in purple here, the ones with the lowest rates of climatic warming and also with the greatest variation in regional topography, were the ones that might have the greatest potential to act as refugia for species from climate change. So is this kind of effect of topographic variation also likely to protect species in a region of southern Europe where many more species might actually reach the lower latitudinal limits of their species distributions, and where we also might have many more endemic species restricted to these kind of high elevation regions? Well, one sort of simple way of looking at it might be by considering what's the standard deviation across 10 kilometer squares in maximum July temperature. As we expect, we get greater variation in the high elevation regions, such as across the Sistema Central, in the Pyrenees, and in the Cantabrian Mountains here. Okay, so how much can these mountain regions in central Spain really sort of act as these refugia from surrounding conditions? Well, the British author Laurie Lee, sort of in a literary sense, already kind of identified this local refugial potential when he was walking across Spain. And when he camped a night in the Sierra de Guadarrama, he said, "I seem to be in a pocket of northern Europe full of the cold splendor Finnish gods. Yes, it provides locally cooler conditions than the surroundings of the mesetas of the Iberian Peninsula, but of course, temperature conditions have been warming considerably in the mountain regions of the Iberian Peninsula. So from the 1960s through to our earlier butterfly surveys in 2004 and 5, there was an increase of some 1.4 degrees C. And then from 2004 and 5 through to 2017, there was a further increase of almost 0.8 degrees C in the Sierra de Guadarrama. And again, we get this variation from year to year. So we get cool years interspersed with hot years. We get dry years interspersed with wet years. And we might get different trends in climatic conditions between climatic variables and also between different seasons. So we expect that probably the species occurring at different parts of their elevational distributions will also experience either improving or declining conditions from year to year, which lead to population dynamic responses and potentially local extinctions or colonizations. So we went back into the field in 2017 and we revisited 120 sites to look for evidence that extinctions and colonizations were happening over the elevational ranges of species that we'd studied in 2004 and 5. Here's an example of the kind of data that we collected for this species, Hiponephelli lecaon. We have the locations shown in black here, where the species was present in both of those two time periods. And then we have the ones which are black on the left and white on the right, which appeared to have where the population appeared to have disappeared from one year to the next survey, and the ones here where there appeared to be some evidence of a colonization where it was absent from the first survey but present in the second one. Of course, we get this kind of data. So we had 5 samples throughout the butterfly season in spring and summer in 2004 or 5, and 5 samples then in 2017. And so we get this kind of information with the presence of the proportion of sites where a species is present in 2004 or 5, shown in black here, and the proportion of sites at different altitudes where it was present in 2017, shown in white. It appears that it was present at fewer sites at lower altitudes in the second period, but obviously we have imperfect detection. So we used a dynamic occupancy model to account for this imperfect detectability, and we modeled the effects of elevation on chances of colonization and chances of local extinction of these species. So here's a model for Hiponephelli lecaon of the chances of local extinction from the first period to the latter period. Higher chances of local extinction at lower altitudes, but also we get higher chances of colonization at lower altitudes, because there at the edge of the species range, the chances are that perhaps in a good year, the species might actually recolonize some sites that it was absent from in the past. So we get this kind of blinking in and out of populations at the lower elevation limit of the species. However, when we look across 42 species in this mountain range, these bars show out of those 42 species, the number of species that showed an effect of elevation in the dynamic occupancy model on either occupancy or detectability or extinction or rates of colonization. And it looks like, well, in fact, for twice as many species, we had effects of elevation on chances of local extinction. So it looks generally like these species are showing elevation or retractions in their species distributions. And then if we look across those species in general, the average altitude at which they occurred increased over the course of those 13 years. What does that then mean for the communities where they occur? So again, quantified using the community temperature index. As you would imagine, if in general the species are shifting their distributions up the slopes of the mountains, we also record an increase in the community temperature index, because the species occurring at lower elevations in the past tend to be associated with warmer conditions across the European distribution. So we got an increase on average of 0.15 degrees C in the CTI across those local sites in the Sierra de Guadarrama. So yes, it looks like CTI is increasing, but do we observe those kind of changes in butterfly communities right across the Iberian Peninsula? And so this last part of the talk is looking at some recent work that we've just published with Juan Pablo and with Mario Mingaro and other members of the group, looking at evidence from the Iberian Butterfly Atlas that there have been changes before and after 1980 in butterfly communities across the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, here, we're like with the English study I talked about, we do depend on the adequacy with which the butterfly communities have been sampled across the landscape. So for this study, we restricted our research to 115 10-kilometer grid cells, which were the best sampled in terms of the Butterfly Atlas data. Those are the ones that are shown as these black squares on the two left-hand figures here. So these two figures show the average annual temperature from 1980 to 2016 across the peninsula and the average precipitation. And of course, we get these sort of west to east and north to south and low altitude to high altitude gradients in climatic conditions. We've also seen quite substantial increases in temperature over time. The dotted line here shows the two periods we looked at, before and after 1980. Precipitation, very variable over time, with some indication of an average decline since about 1980. So for those 115 grid cells, we find that community temperature index in those cells was, across the landscape, positively related to mean annual temperature, and that community precipitation index, so this is based on the same idea as the CTI, so we take the average precipitation across the wider geographic distribution of the species, and then we take the average for the species that occur in a given cell. Yes, these appear to respond, as you would expect, to the geographic variation in average climatic conditions. But then if we look at changes before and after 1980, temperature had increased in all of those 115 grid cells, and precipitation had decreased in 111 of the 115 grid cells. But across the butterfly communities, some of them increased in CTI and in CPI, and some of them decreased in CTI or CPI. So we don't get any significant change in community temperature or community precipitation index. Well, one thing we noticed was that generally within those 10-kilometer squares, the 1 kilometer variation in those climatic conditions was actually greater than the rate at which the average conditions had changed over time. So this suggests in the first instance that species might have the opportunity to redistribute themselves within the 10-kilometer squares, as indeed we've been seeing with the elevational range shifts in the Sierra de Guadarrama. We then looked at the rates of CTI change and the rates of CPI change across each of those 115 squares, and we related them to a number of variables such as the rate of temperature change in the cell, the distance from the coast, the longitude, the latitude, the average elevation, and the standard deviation in climatic conditions or in elevation within each of those 10-kilometer cells, to try and get an idea of the factors that might be affecting the rates at which communities were changing. And we found that in both cases, the change in CTI showed a positive response to the change in temperature. So if the temperature changed more, we had some evidence that CTI had increased more. Yep. And the CPI, again, where conditions have become much drier, perhaps the CPI reduced more.
Robert, can you just take?
Yeah, we're just getting to the end. We're just getting to the end. But we also found some evidence of geographic effects on these rates of change, particularly, for example, that temperature changed less where elevation was more variable, and also that CPI, it was sort of maintained, it was more positive where there was greater local variation in precipitation. So these topographically variable regions appeared to show reduced rates of climatic change. So we've maybe got some evidence for buffering effects of local climatic variation or topographic variation. Obviously, we've got limitations in the data. So what we're doing in our current project is across 4 mountain systems. We're going back to a number of field sites that have got recent records from the 1980s through to 2005 to look at how topographic variation can actually modify the responses of regional fauna. So these are the 4 regions where we've started our big field surveys this summer. They vary in their precipitation. They vary relatively little in their temperature conditions. And they also appear to vary quite substantially in their community temperature index and community precipitation index. So to summarize, community changes and geographic scale shifts in species ranges are driven fundamentally by local colonizations and extinctions, and these reflect population responses to climatic variability, which is responding to local topographic or vegetation effects on microclimatic conditions. And I hope that this presentation goes some way to at least suggesting that this local microclimatic heterogeneity can act as a buffer against climatic change, and that perhaps by identifying the landscape or vegetation conditions that lead to these buffering effects, we can identify micro-refugia or refugia from climate change, and how we can employ these in prioritizing sites or habitats for conservation, and helping to assess which taxa might be, or which regions might be most at risk. And here are some of the many people and organizations that have assisted in this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. This was a very interesting indeed. It's already complicated to try to analyze in a bigger scale. The micro scale is quite fascinating and very relevant indeed, of course. So we have time for a few questions.
Do you want me to stop sharing the screen?
If you want, or yeah. I don't know if there is any question that is relevant.
Yes, it's possible.
The slide, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So no questions. I have
one question.
I
raised my hand, but you can start, Ida.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because you speak a lot about the spatial scale, and what about the temporal scale? For instance, the fact that there are seasons, right? And these seasons and the way the temporal scale behaves may be quite relevant, no?
Yes, so one of the things that we've already started doing for those 4 different mountain ranges in central Spain is we've started looking at the different rates at which conditions have been changing in the different seasons, and there are really some quite substantial differences in rates of warming at different times of year, and they differ between the different regions as well. So yes, and therefore that's going to affect species depending on the times of the year that the sensitive developmental stages, the stage, you know, whether a stage is particularly sensitive, which occurs during a particular season. Also, species, of course, are moving the times of year at which those sensitive stages might be active, because of generally phenology moving earlier in the year, which might which could buffer species against the effects of climatic warming. So for spring species, if they start becoming active earlier in the year, it could actually sort of lead to a cooling effect. Whereas a summer species, say a species that formerly was active in late August, if it's now active in early August or late July or something, that may sort of exaggerate the kind of heating that it's actually exposed to. So it's very complicated, and it's really interesting. Yeah.
Christina?
Thank you very much, Rob. It was really interesting, this presentation. I was thinking, of course, this micro-refuge, these microclimatic conditions, you imagine that you need a certain number of conditions for these micro places to be sweepable. So I was wondering if you have any idea about area in relation to the original macro area where the species were, and the conservation status. So I'd like that you comment on the need, in fact, to have the preservation and all the context of these areas to be well preserved. Otherwise, maybe they will not function, as you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on different species, on the size of a population or of a metapopulation of a species which is needed for it to actually persist for a long period of time. And that's going to vary between species depending on how variable their population dynamics are, on how dispersive they are. And it's going to vary also depending on how many resources occurring in different types of microhabitat a species might need during its life cycle. So for flying insects, the habitat used by the adult and the egg and larval stages could actually be quite different, one from the other. And of course, those two stages might be active at different times of year as well. I think as much as we can, if we can conserve habitats regionally that cover heterogeneous conditions moving from lowland from representative amounts of lowland and upland, or moving across representative amounts of woodland through scrub to grassland, then that will favor as wide a variety of species as possible. So I think again, this is quite different in the Iberian Peninsula than it is in the United Kingdom, because in many parts of the Iberian Peninsula, we still have regions of quite heterogeneous topographical and habitat conditions in which there's limited intensive human land use. In the British Isles, most natural and semi-natural habitats are extremely fragmented. And so you might have much bigger effects of metapopulation dynamics just causing species to die out very quickly from a region. So there may actually be, although warming and drying may be much more dangerous for species in the Iberian Peninsula, the fact that there's a relatively large amount of natural habitat remaining, which is pretty variable, may actually give some kind of insurance against climate change effects if those areas can be protected effectively.
Okay, I think that we might have time for just a very quick question and answer, if there is any other. I think not. Anyway,
let me just say to Robert that it's a pity that the Iberian Peninsula stays sometimes in the maps that dark part
I
of
know.
Portugal,
I
and
know.
I really, for me, it's really, but it's difficult, I know. But who knows that maybe in the future, because I can imagine that you have such nice gradients if you go to the coast, and also as
Yeah.
as a case study with the
Yeah.
warm and the coast and the Atlantic.
Yeah.
I really,
Yeah.
it-
Well, just to
we
say
have to
goodbye
go.
there.
Sorry, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. It would be for the entire afternoon, I'm sure. You have the contact of Robert if you have any other issues or questions.
we
I'm
will
sure.
invite him. We
I'm
will
sure,
invite
yeah.
him to come
Yeah,
here.
yeah, I'm sure there are many questions.